Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, last week, Anna Soubry, the former Tory minister, said that if the Brexiteers took control of her party, she might have to leave it and form some kind of new alliance. Pretty extraordinary stuff. Is this practical politics? Is this a real threat to Theresa May's Brexit plans? To try to find out, I'm joined by Anna Soubry and the kind of person she'd like to form an alliance with, the Labour MP, Chuka Umunna. Now, there the two of you are, cosily, friendly on the sofa. An awful lot of people, 17+ million, who voted for Brexit are going to say, there you go, they haven't accepted the referendum result. Even now, they're trying to frustrate it. This is an unholy parliamentarian plot.
Well, what I say is I'm interested in making sure that we get the best deal that we possibly can, that we get a Brexit that absolutely puts our economy at the front.
So
but
you
the most important
Brexit's going to happen?
The most important thing is that we continue to put our country's interests first and foremost, and that actually is our constituents' interests. We both voted for Article 50 to be triggered. People often forget that. And the other thing that I would say to you...
I was just rolling my eyebrows. I don't know if you saw them. I was asking you, do you think Brexit will definitely happen?
Will it definitely... I genuinely don't know what is going to happen.
So it might be stopped?
Well, it would not be... I'll tell you who might stop it, and that's the people of this country. We won't stop it. It is the people. We gave the people a referendum to start this process, and exactly. But we should also be clear.
There is no majority in the House of Commons for us simply to jump off a cliff. Nobody voted to be poorer. You're right to refer to that referendum in 2016, but nobody voted for us to jump off a cliff. And the point here is, increasingly what you're seeing is people seeking to put ideology before the national interest. The ultimate example of that is the Good Friday Agreement. We know that if we come out of the customs union and the single market, all sides have been very clear that you will potentially threaten the Good Friday settlement. Are we really going to put that all at risk for ideology? So if this, however this pans out, the national interest has to come first, and that's why you have people working across parties to make sure that's the case.
Can I just walk you through the democracy side of this?
Yes.
Which is, it seems to me that it would tear a hole in our democracy if Brexit was reversed without the public having another say at some point. So if Brexit was to be stopped, there would have to be a second referendum. But we know perfectly well, because you're sitting there saying so, Jeremy Corbyn won't call one, and we know that Theresa May won't call one for obvious reasons as well. Therefore, unless there is a majority in the House of Commons for something that the party leaderships are against, it won't happen. Well, that is not practical politics, is it?
Well, hang on just a minute. I mean, you can't... this whole thing, in the end, it will be the people that decide it. You're absolutely right. And to my mind, you can't thwart the will of the people if they're the ones that get the final say. But in the end, Parliament is not a bystander in this process. No. Parliament gets to determine what will happen. Now, my own personal view is I would like to see the people get the final say with the option to remain in. But at the end of the day, this is for Parliament to determine.
And your joint determination is that Parliament will have a clear, decisive vote on whatever terms Theresa May reveals to the country in due course.
And all options must be available to Parliament as well. And the real thing is this: if this government doesn't get this right, it will end up in a position whereby the majority of members of Parliament, putting their constituents first, will find themselves unable to vote for a withdrawal agreement, and then the government will find
it's out with no agreement. Then it really is the cliff edge.
No, there are options, and that's our point.
That's the point.
What are the options? Because people say to me again and again, if Parliament votes down whatever deal Theresa May gets, then that is leaving the EU. Because we triggered Article 50, we leave without a deal.
We secured a meaningful vote before Christmas. Dominic Grieve tabled the amendment. There was a majority in Parliament for it. And what it ensures is that Parliament doesn't just give the government a blank cheque, but we get to actually have a voice and influence all the different scenarios.
And when we went over to Europe, one of the big messages, and we saw lots and lots of disparate people, one of the big messages was that if we don't take a withdrawal agreement, there are other options. That's not just staying in the European Union, it's also the Norwegian model. And the big mistake that's being made is that the debate in Cabinet is between Canada and Canada+++, when it's obvious...
So Norway's gone?
Exactly, and that's a huge mistake, because from the European point of view, it's a choice between Norway and Canada, and we've made a mistake with these red lines.
There's a delusion that you can have your cake and eat it. You can't have your cake and eat it. It doesn't matter how many times you say you can have it, you can't.
Theresa May's made it clear that she's going to come out with her clear preferred option for how we leave the EU later this month. We're going to see it. What could she say that would calm you both down?
Oh, from my point of view, I want to see EFTA. That is what I want to see. Absolutely.
So we are still inside a free trade area?
Yes. So it's the European Free Trade Area. That makes us members of the EEA. In the Norwegian model, the Norwegians have control over their fisheries policy, their agricultural policy.
Okay.
I also want us to stay in the, not a, I'm not messing about with words, the customs union for exactly the reasons...
So that's not going to happen, is it? The Cabinet are never going to agree that, are they?
Well, they don't. As Chuka says, not only is it bad for our economy, but it also fundamentally undermines the peace process that was achieved. And so this is really important.
It's hard to see how she could produce a deal that you will back. Chuka, can I ask same sort of question to you about Jeremy Corbyn? You've heard him absolutely rule out a second referendum, absolutely rule out a customs union. What more? And yet we hear rumours, there's kind of stories in the papers that perhaps behind the scenes he's slightly more open-minded. Are you making any kind of progress with the Labour leadership?
I think Jeremy is open-minded. Over the summer, last summer, he moved us to a position where we would stay in the single market and the customs union for transition. But I have to say, Andrew, I cannot conceive of circumstances where Labour MPs are marshalled to go through the lobby and vote against us staying in the customs union and the single market with the likes of Jacob Rees-Mogg, Boris Johnson and Michael Gove. I cannot see Jeremy saying to Labour MPs, we're going through the lobby with those guys and damaging the interests of our constituents.
We're running out of time. One really important last question to both of you. Is it conceivable that you can get a majority? Do you really believe you have a majority in the House of Commons on the Tory side and the Labour side coming together to defeat the kind of Brexit the Prime Minister wants?
If she's not careful, yes. But there's already a big shift.
That smashes the party system.
Well, it may well do. But there is a real shift amongst what I call leave-alites, reluctant Remainers, who are seeing the attraction of EFTA on the backbenchers. And finally, can I just say this? It's really important.
Very quickly,
I wish Chuka would come into the lobby with me, but he doesn't. There was a very good police settlement last week, which you went and voted against, Chuka.
But you
and
Anna doesn't vote with me on the NHS.
Exactly.
But this is bigger. This is bigger.
This is bigger than anything.
You are closer to each other, not just physically now, but you are closer to each other politically.
What are you saying?
You are closer to each other politically than you are to people.
Brexit,
you are closer to him than you are to Jacob Rees-Mogg. You are closer to her than you are to John McDonnell. Sure.
I just don't see it like you're making this about individuals and parties. And the point about this...
Don't be ungallant, Chuka.
This is bigger. It's bigger than party. We won't be forgiven by future generations if we play party politics with this issue. Is this the beginning of a new alliance?
No, I mean, look, this is, as Chuka says, this is the issue upon which we are absolutely united, and that's the most important thing, because we're putting our country and our constituents first. And that's what everybody else has got to do, not just MPs, but also British business has got to speak up for the economic Brexit that everybody's crying out for.
Time's up. You heard it here first, folk. Thanks both very much indeed. Now, listening to all of that, a loyal member of Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet, Labour's community spokesman, Andrew Gwynn. Andrew Gwynn, you have said in the past that Brexit could tear the Labour Party in two. After you've heard Chuka Umunna there being close with Anna Soubry, do you feel that's coming about?
Absolutely not. I think what we've got is actually quite a coherent position in that what we've said is there needs to be a transitional period, and that transitional period accepts that we will be part of the single market and part of the customs union.
But only for a couple of years. It doesn't really solve the end problem.
But the point, Andrew, is that it's acting as that bridge to the new relationship with the European Union. We are leaving the European Union. We had a referendum on this. And how we get to that final destination and what that final destination looks like shouldn't be rushed to a March 2019 deadline. I think all are agreed that actually the government is going to struggle to get a bespoke deal by March 2019. That's why we need a proper transitional period, time limited, so that we can get that deal that we want to see.
Michel Barnier has been very clear that to get the transition, we must agree to all of their terms or else. Are you concerned the transition period, given where we are now, may not happen?
Well, I think where the government is should send worrying signals to the country at large, because they have ruled out a number of measures that we would like to see in the transitional period. We've said that we will accept the rules and regulations of the single market. We will be part of the single market and customs union for the transitional period. That's important so that we can get to a position that we need to be when we're outside of the European Union.
Let's talk about the position you need to get to. Owen Smith, you know, your shadow cabinet colleague, has been absolutely clear, tweeting just yesterday, a hard border, he's talking about Northern Ireland, of course, must be avoided, and it's only membership of the single market and customs union that can guarantee the open border, so important for the Good Friday Agreement. That is a breach of party discipline and party policy, is it not?
Well, no. I mean, what Owen is saying is that one way of avoiding a hard border is to ensure that the current arrangements continue between the UK and the European Union. Of course, that would make Britain...
he says it's the only way. He says you have to stay in those things or else. And that is way, way away from your policy.
That would make Britain a rule taker and not a rule maker.
A vassal state.
And so I think what we've got to do, Andrew, is we've got to make sure that there is a Brexit deal that secures the benefits of the single market, that mirrors the rules and the conditions of the single market.
It will mirror the rules and the conditions.
Because what we don't want to do is we don't want to end up with workers' conditions, environmental protections being less in the United Kingdom than elsewhere in Europe. But we need to make those rules ourselves.
And this is a crucial question facing the country. And the Labour Party believes in giving your own members a proper say. You've got 8 policy commissions now designed to allow ordinary Labour Party members and even voters to have their say in shaping the policy. How many of those 8 commissions deal with Brexit?
All 8.
None.
No, all 8. I think you'll find, Andrew, I'm a co-chair of the Communities Commission, and on each of those commissions we have a dedicated member that is looking at the impacts of Brexit in each policy area.
A lot of your own MPs think you have sliced it up so finely there is no real forum to debate.
Well, you can't go from there being no policy commissions dealing with Brexit to now it being sliced up finely. There are 8 policy commissions dealing with a whole range of public policy, all of whom are looking at Brexit.
Why have 30 of your colleagues written to the National Executive Committee asking for a proper debate on Brexit because they feel that it's being pushed to one side, and in the words of Heidi Alexander, it's a really, really important issue and it's being treated like a marginal one?
Well, I don't think it is being treated like a marginal, because wherever we go and whatever we do, Brexit is always the #1 subject.
OK. Very, very quickly, can I just be absolutely clear? When it comes to not being a member of the customs union and not being a member of the single market, that is absolutely, clearly Labour Party policy and will not change.
The Labour Party policy, and Keir Starmer has made it very clear, is that we don't take anything off the table. That's the mistake. That's the mistake.
Because you yourself have said that you could change policy if public opinion changed.
That's the mistake that the current government have made. They've ruled everything out. Now, we've said we want to have the benefits of the single market. We also, Andrew, want to have that tariff-free, custom-free trade with Europe, and that means having some form of a customs union with the European Union.
Cake and cake eaten, many people would say. Let me move, however, to your own department. We've seen a whole series of really, really bad crises in Conservative councils around the country. Surrey, Northamptonshire and many more. Yep. Big, big budget deficits. Will a Labour government give them the extra money they need?
Well, what we've said is that we will fully resource local government. In our manifesto for the last general election, we identified £2 billion for this year that we would have invested directly in local government services. But on top of that, we were putting money into adult social care, children's services and early years as well.
Many of which have been cut in the past.
But it's those things that are really tipping councils over that financial cliff edge.
Absolutely right. But can I ask you very clearly, would you reverse the cuts the Conservatives have made to local authorities?
Well, we've said, and I've just said now, that we will invest in adult social care, children's services. Well, investing in those services means that we are putting money in. We are helping councils avoid that financial cliff edge that
But a radical government should be able to say we're going to reverse those cuts, and you can't say that, presumably because they're too expensive.
Well, I've just said that we will put money back in. So, for example, the Local Government Association, Andrew, says that councils need £2 billion on children's services alone.
Let's turn, in that case, to how we raise the £2 billion.
Well, at the budget, and this comes on to the point, the Conservative government cut £5 billion on the bank levy. We opposed that. We said that £2 billion of that should be given to children's services this year, precisely the money the Local Government Association said it needs.
In the end, if taxpayers want better local services, then one way or another, they're going to have to pay for that. It's been a long, long time since we've had a council tax revaluation. 1991 was the last time. And you have yourself said this is an absurd situation. Can you tell us today that the Labour government in power will have another revaluation of council tax properties and bands?
I think we need to be more radical. I think we need to look afresh at how we fund local government going forward.
So a totally different system.
Well, and that's a big piece of work that we are going to undertake. Because
I can't stop without asking you a little bit more about that.
The problem about this, Andrew, is that council tax is broken. It is not fit for purpose. 1% increase in council tax on my own local authority, Tameside in Greater Manchester, brings in just £700,000.
So
and yet our social care gap this year is £16 million. That does not fix the problem.
So we push council tax away into history and we replace it with something else. Now, there has been a suggestion that land value tax is something that your party is looking at.
Well, we are looking at what we need to do to fix how we finance local government going forward. We've not made up our minds on what that will be. It might be that the council tax can be reformed.
An extra income tax,
It might be that the council tax can be reformed. There are lots of other examples of how local authorities raise revenues across the country, and we need to have a genuinely open mind and an open discussion about this.
Very, very general question in that case. Have you a completely open mind as to whether a new tax to pay for local authority would remain essentially a property-based tax, a land tax or a reformed kind of council tax or whatever, or the rates, whatever it might be, on the one hand, or some extra form of income tax, as they use, for instance, in the United States?
Well, let's look at what works, and let's look at what works in this country. I will take international examples, but you put some of those policy ideas through the machine, and what comes out at the other end might not work in this country. But what is crucial is that we properly fund local services, because local government is on the brink of collapse.
Lots of aspirations. We haven't got clear answers. We wait agog to find out what you're going to do. Thank you very much indeed, Andrew Gwynne.
Now, as the Prime Minister gathered her Brexit Cabinet subcommittee around her earlier this week, the British Chamber of Commerce published an open letter calling for a clear statement of intent to be laid out. It wasn't. So where does this leave business? I'm joined by the co-founder of Innocent Drinks and Open Britain supporter, Richard Reid, and Lance Foreman, owner of smoked salmon business H. Foreman & Sons. Lovely to see you both this Sunday morning. Richard, let's start with you. I mean, we have heard on this programme from a number of businesses, time and time again, that clarity is what is needed, both as to transition period and to where we're ultimately going to end up. Why is that? And what do you think of what you've heard so far?
Well, there's an absolute lack of clarity. And as you say, that's probably the single most damaging thing to business. Business would rather get a straight negative answer early, so then it can make plans, than not know where we're heading, which, as a country, we simply do not. I think, really, the government's strategy seems to be, let's wait and see what corner we get painted into, and then say that's the answer. Business can't operate like that. We need to know at least 1-2 years in advance. If you want to build a factory, to employ people, you need to know, am I going to be sited here or am I going to be sited in Europe? So we need clarity of the situation. But, of course, they can't give clarity of the situation because the government is so divided about the kind of Brexit that it wants. The one thing that's consistent is the voice of entrepreneurship in this country. 97% of entrepreneurs don't want to leave. They think it's a bad idea to leave. But they're very clear that if we have to leave, let's make sure the deal is agreed before we actually step through that door. Because if we step through that door without having agreed a deal, we then throw away any negotiation position we have. Unfortunately, the government doesn't seem to really understand that position.
Lance, I mean, are you not in any way concerned about the fact that we've heard this week from Michel Barnier, do you know what, transition period, it's not a given?
Not at all. In fact, I don't really see the point in a transition period. The whole point of Article 50 was that was the transition. You know, when people voted for Brexit, they thought long and hard. You know, it wasn't as binary as the media is making out at the moment. A lot of people that I know, I think most people sort of felt there were pluses of leaving and pluses of staying. And they did think long and hard, and they voted to leave. And when they voted to leave, they didn't vote for a deal. Nobody talked about soft Brexit or hard Brexit. It was either we
Wasn't
stay
that a
in...
mistake, though? Perhaps there should have been greater discussion in the business community and more broadly about the potential outcomes.
No, not at all. I think people just felt that it wasn't working for Britain. You know, it really isn't working for people, and that's why they wanted to leave. And if it was such a great, you know, if this was such a great club, we wouldn't want to leave. The EU wouldn't be threatening us to, you know, if we do leave. They're running it more like a protection racket, trying to do what they can to scare us. And that's really not something we want to be part of. It's just not working for people in Britain anymore.
At the very least, Richard, you can understand why there are people out there who look at the rhetoric emerging from Brussels and agree with Lance that there is a punitive element to the way in which we're being dealt with by the European Union at the moment.
No, I totally disagree. I mean, if you look at what they actually say, they're bending over backwards to say that there's no punishment here. They just keep reminding us very politely that it was us that chose to leave, so we need to say what it is that we want. Angela Merkel's just saying, look, tell me what you want, and then we can help you get there. But Britain is like, no, you tell us. We're like, they're just saying quite reasonably, you decided to leave. And by the way, when it came to the Brexit decision, I negotiated most of the people on the other side. They were absolutely equivocal. Of course we will stay and have unfettered access to the single market. Of course we're not going to be leaving the customs union. In the same way they said, of course there'll be £350 million going to the NHS. The Brexit that this country was promised is not the Brexit that's being delivered. It's absolutely a different bill of goods. And I think as just pragmatic patriots, we have to be able to, clear-sighted, take a look at the deal that they finally do negotiate and say, is that good for this country or not? If it's good for this country, I'll be the first one to advocate for it. If it's not good for this country, if it's actually going to damage this country, then I'll be saying we've reserved the right to change our minds, or at least have a rethink.
Well, I've got to disagree with you, Richard. You know,
which bit?
The EU works for big business, but most people in Britain are employed by small businesses, and it's small businesses that suffered over the years all the regulations, day after day, sort of new regulations that keep coming through that make it very difficult for them. Big businesses are bureaucracies themselves. They lobby the EU to put in rules to protect their businesses, which stops small disruptive businesses coming through. And it's, you know, small businesses employ more people in the UK than big business does. And as I say, this Brexit was about the little man. It was about the little man standing up to this sort of cronyist corporate world and this sort of bureaucratic world and saying, look, we've had enough, there's a different way. Most countries in the world don't have a trade deal with the EU. We don't need a trade deal with the EU to trade. Our biggest trading partner in the world is the USA. We don't have a trade deal with them, yet we still trade. So it's, you know, we don't need a trade deal to trade.
This is one of the things that's awkward when you're sort of having a debate with someone from the Vote Leave side. Day is night and night is day. They're putting that the EU is there for big business. The EU there is to protect the common man. At its heart, it is to protect humans and societies and communities against the ravages of international capitalism.
Well, it's not doing a very good job.
The people that paid for Brexit are a billionaire elite. The actual whole principle of Brexit is to bring together a continent so it can trade and be peaceful and be prosperous, which
Richard,
is done brilliantly.
Would you at least accept that the pseudoscientists, the economists, actually, they're saying that there will be a negative impact directly as a result of a hard Brexit, that they could well be wrong, and that actually, in the medium to long term, the freeing up of ourselves from the regulatory environment imposed upon us by the European Union might well give us the opportunity to get the economy back on track in a way in which we haven't been able to since the banks went down?
I don't know, when 99% of the world economists say it's going to have a negative effect on the economy, I tend to side with them. There's 1% that say, no, it's going to be good, but 99%, it's like climate change scientists. 99% of them say climate change is real. I'm going to go with them.
So when does your confidence come then, Lance?
Well, my confidence comes from my own experience, and I disagree with the point about entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs welcome change. Change provides opportunity. You know, every day in our lives, change is happening, but it's small incremental change and we don't notice it. It's like you're on this treadmill. And it's only after 20 years or 30, 40 years you look back and you think, oh, my goodness, how on earth did I get into this situation?
Coming out of the European Union is not small incremental
No, but
change.
that's the beauty of it. It is a massive change. It throws us off that treadmill. It allows us to step back and say, we're in a whole new world here. How can we seize the good stuff, shed the bad stuff? And I think that this is the greatest opportunity for Britain in a generation, and we should seize it really positively.
And so far, this opportunity, in inverted commas, that we've chosen has meant that we've gone from being the best performing economy in the G7 to the worst performing economy in the G7. It has seen our wages go down in real terms. The nurses have started leaving. Young people feel that they've had their futures taken. How that is opportunity. And 97% of entrepreneurs of small businesses want to stay in. 97%. It's a fact.
Do you know what? I somewhat suspect that this will be a debate that we return to time and time again. Richard Reid, Lance Furman, thank you both very much indeed for joining us.
But as it is still not clear what the government wants its final relationship with the EU to look like, we thought we would try and help out by looking in detail at that key dilemma when it comes to working out a customs arrangement. Should we hug the EU close or break out on our own? So we've lined up two politicians from either side of the argument, and for a change, they'll be asking the questions, not me. So I'm joined by the soon-to-be former Conservative MEP and leading figure in the Leave campaign, Daniel Hannan, and by the former Labour frontbencher and supporter of Open Britain, Seema Malhotra. A little earlier this morning, we tossed a coin to see who would start. Daniel Hannan won, and he agreed that he would go first. So here he is with his thoughts on what our end relationship should be.
90% of the world's economic growth over the next 15 years will come from outside the European Union. Britain is a maritime nation, linked to the world's fastest growing economies by language and law, culture and kinship. But we can't sign trade deals with them. Not while we're in the EU's customs union. Staying in the customs union after we leave would be the worst of all worlds. It would give Brussels 100% control of our trade policy with 0% input from us. In order to take advantage of Brexit, we need to set our own regulations. Sometimes, for reasons of economies of scale, we might want to match what the EU is doing. If we do want to keep elements of the single market, though, it must be through agreement and on a case-by-case basis. In 1980, the states now in the European Union accounted for 30% of the world's GDP. Today that figure is 15% and falling. Britain needs to raise its eyes. Our future's bright. Our future's global.
Well, Seema and Dan are both with me now, and just to explain the rules, Seema has 5 minutes to interrogate Dan. She can only ask questions, and Dan can only give answers. He can't ask questions back. So, Seema, your 5 minutes starts now.
Dan, it's just over a year until we leave the European Union, and this week a Tory MP said, I think there's a real concern now about the direction of travel when it comes to Brexit. We're at a real crunch point, and the government hasn't worked out, 19 months on, what the end game is, and we need to know. That's pretty clear, isn't it? And you and others said that Brexit was going to be easy. So why is this the case?
Well, nothing worth doing is ever easy. It's worth doing, and in a few years' time we'll look back and wonder why it took us so long. But I don't accept that the government hasn't made its position clear. The government made its position clear first in Theresa May's Lancaster House speech, then in a series of white papers or position papers that have been produced since. We want to have, as she keeps saying, control of our laws, of our taxes, of our borders. But within that, we want to have the closest possible relationship with the rest of the EU, compatible with being a sovereign country. We want to be its best friend and closest ally. And that will mean that in some areas we do align with the EU as a friend and ally, but it means that we'll do so on our own terms.
But things aren't going according to plan, are they? And you and others said that we would be keeping key agencies. David Davis said that we would keep agencies. Then he said that he hoped we'd keep them. And now they're leaving. The European Medicines Agency is heading for Amsterdam. The European Banking Agency will go to Paris. That's 2,000 highly skilled jobs being lost from the capital. Isn't this a high price that we're paying for this uncertainty?
If you're that fixated on 2,000 Eurocrats' jobs and you've nothing to say about the 500,000 jobs that have been created over the same period, then I think, Seema, there's something wrong with your sense of priorities. All of the predictions we had about job losses during the referendum campaign turned out to be nonsense. Instead of losing 500,000, we've gained 500,000. Since then, more people are working than ever before. And no, I never claimed that we'd be keeping these Euro agencies in the UK. Of course, if you leave the EU, you leave these regulatory agencies and you no longer have them on your soil. And the flip side of that is that we're in a position to make our own regulations to suit our own conditions and
You are
needs.
calling these agencies bureaucrats. These are people who are helping us with key parts of our economy, key sectors that are important for our economy as a whole, scientists, those who are experts in finance and other sectors. Now, I agree that Britain could trade more with the world, and we need to. But the evidence from leaks from the government this week show the impact of free trade deals around the world will in no way compensate for the loss of trade with the EU, which a hard Brexit would do to the UK. Now, if you don't believe me, you can listen to the words of the Prime Minister, who said during the referendum, we export more to Ireland than we do to China, twice as much to Belgium as we do to India. It is not realistic to think we could just replace European trade with these new markets. Now,
we export more to Ireland than to the whole of China. That is our problem. That is precisely our problem. Which of those two is the better long-term growth prospect?
Don't you agree that there is going to be an impact on British businesses and families, even for the short term? And isn't it important that you raise that risk and share that risk with the British people?
Obviously, what we want is to have free and frictionless trade with the EU and the freedom to make trade deals further afield. The EU doesn't have any trade deal in place with the US, which is the world's largest economy, with China, which is its second largest, with fast-growing economies like India, with old friends like Australia. The idea that we can't do better as a free-trading maritime country, making our own trade deals and bringing benefits to people in this country, I just think is incredibly defeatist. And are we really saying that it's a good future for us to be selling more to Ireland with 5 million people than to China with more than 1 billion? I mean, that seems to me quite an unambitious vision of our future.
Study after study, Dan, and you will know this when you do your research, that shows that the proximity that we have to nations goes a long way to determining our economic links. That's the case not just for us, but for countries around the world. Now, of course, we could do more. We actually have a trade surplus with the United States of America already. And in fact, the government had an export strategy. I've argued for more to be done. I've talked to people, investors from other countries, who have said that they want to come and do more in the UK. But the point is that part of the reason they do that is because we've got access, and they have access, to the European market of 500 million people in order to sell those goods too. What do you say to the genuine concerns from Nissan, from Honda, now even the Japanese ambassador, talking about a challenge to the profitability of those companies in the UK and the threat that they may have to leave those operations and go elsewhere?
Well, they made those threats during the referendum, and after the vote was in, when they knew we were leaving, they confirmed that they were not only staying here, but that Nissan was substantially increasing its productivity and its activity in the UK. So I think you should look at what they're doing rather than what they're now saying. But this idea that we are defined by our geography is a very old-fashioned kind of 19th or 18th century way of looking at trade. In the modern age, when we have very low freight costs, we have the internet, we have cheap flights, geographical proximity has never mattered less, and we are linked by language and law, by culture, by legal systems, accountancy systems, to the fastest growing economies in the planet. That's where we need to be.
Time's up, I'm afraid. You've had your 5 minutes. We have to be strict with the rules. I want to nip in though and ask you, Dan, I mean, you've set out your vision for how you would like to see our future relationship with the EU. How confident are you that the Prime Minister is going to outline a clear vision soon and that it will align with yours? Well,
she's outlined the broad principles already, and then they were given quite... They have been fleshed out on issues like how to make the Irish border work, how to make the facilitation of customs work. I mean, this thing that nobody has explained what we can do in terms of customs isn't true. The government produced a quite lengthy paper talking about how we can do things like expand the Common Transit Convention, authorise more local economic operators. It's worth noting that both the head of HMRC here and his equivalent in the Republic of Ireland have said that there is no need for a customs border, that companies can make their customs declarations in the way that they make their tax declarations. So I'm just struck by all the people who said listen to the experts during the campaign, now emphatically choosing not to listen to the experts when they say that they don't need a hard border in Ireland.
OK, Dan, thanks for that. Now it's the turn of Seema to be grilled, but first, here's her thoughts on how our future relationship with the EU should look.
I respect the result of the referendum, and now the task is to move forward in a way that addresses the reasons people voted to leave and protects jobs and the economy. 43% of all of our trade is done with the European Union. Staying inside the customs union gives us tariff-free trade access to our main EU partners. Issues surrounding immigration and sovereignty can be addressed while staying in the customs union and the single market, but on terms that we negotiate. We can also then trade freely with countries the EU has deals with, deals that we have helped negotiate. And staying in the customs union is key to a solution on Ireland. Our select committee found that it is not clear how we can avoid a hard border if we leave the customs union. I agree we need reform and greater controls on the freedom of movement. But people didn't vote to become poorer. So let's leave the European Union in a way that puts the prosperity of families and businesses first.
So, as before, Dan, you now have 5 minutes to question Seema.
Seema, 2 weeks ago, Jeremy Corbyn said that he was against staying in the customs union because, quote, it's protectionist against developing countries. Do you agree?
I think it's important to balance what we do need to see change in terms of international trade and support for developing countries, but also to recognise the contribution that being in the customs union and the European Union has made for our prosperity, for businesses
is that a yes or a no
and families.
Do you agree with Jeremy Corbyn?
I think there's a lot that's been done to support development, support international development. I have laid out my view.
Sorry, forgive me, that's a different question, Seema. We're not talking about international trade. Do you agree that the customs union is protectionist against developing countries?
A customs union can be protectionist for those countries that are in the customs union. I think that is very understood economics, and what it does is it encourages trade creation and development between those countries. But it doesn't preclude, as has been shown by the over 60 trade agreements that we have as a European Union with countries around the world, from having strong relationships with other countries.
So one of the things where we are obliged by the customs union to impose tariffs, there's lots of things that we don't produce ourselves. For example, we have to impose tariffs on oranges. Now, in your constituency and in mine, there are not very many commercial orange plantations. Do you think it's a reasonable thing that to protect Mediterranean orange growers, we should be discriminating against producers in Africa, in the Americas, in developing countries, at a cost to our own consumers?
Well, I believe what you can do is negotiate across the world in terms of how you encourage greater free trade and greater ways in which we can trade with different nations. And that's what we also do already. And we've had an enormous track record of investing and supporting farmers in Africa.
On that point, you're saying that we're going to leave the EU but stay in the customs union. How will we have any influence? That means that we're giving Brussels total control over what our trade policy is, but we're no longer EU members, so we have no input ourselves.
Almost 50% of our trade is with the European Union. Over 70% of the companies that export to the European Union, over 70% of companies that export to the European Union, that's jobs that your constituents and my constituents will be dependent on. Over 90% of that being small and medium-sized enterprises. They look to the relationship that we have.
I'm not having much joy getting answers to the questions. Let me have another go here, because you're going off on a tangent there.
I'm not going on a tangent.
Let me have another go.
What I am saying is we can do both, and that is what we should be doing.
So we can do. So you think that leaving the EU but staying in the customs union, so that Brussels controls 100% of our trade, but we have zero input because we're no longer... You think that somehow gives us more influence in world trade than taking our own voice and our own vote in the World Trade Organization and being able to do our own deals? Is that what you're saying?
You know what is interesting is when you talk about the WTO and WTO rules, Dan, if you look at the government's own analysis, which was an average of other studies, it shows that even in the southeast, if there is a withdrawal based on
I'm going to have one more
Brexit,
go trying to get an answer here,
there will be 5% cut
you're
off
telling me
GDP
lots
in
and
your
lots of interesting things that are not what I'm asking.
16% of the northeast. This country will be poorer.
The highest tariffs imposed by the common external tariff, the customs union, are on the items that most negatively impact people on low incomes, particularly food, clothing and footwear. People on low incomes pay a proportionately higher chunk of their weekly budgets on these commodities, these basic things. They're the most badly hit. So we are clobbering poor people in this country in order to hurt developing nations. How can you, as a progressive politician with a proud history of standing up for people who are underprivileged, now stand there and defend a system that forces us to give more to wealthy French farmers than to poor African farmers, and that forces the highest bills to be paid by the lowest income people in Britain?
Well, I'm going to fundamentally disagree with you, and that won't surprise you, because I do believe that being a member of the European Union has been fundamental for our prosperity, for families and businesses. And what you fail to highlight are numerous studies that show that British families are already hundreds of pounds worse off as a result of us having had the referendum and now the uncertainty that has followed. People have already suffered. You will know this.
That's still not an answer.
You will know this.
That's still
with
not
higher prices and wages that have not gone. And it is Conservative MPs that have raised this in the House of Commons. Dan, you should have a look.
The countries that are closest to the EU economically, the countries that have opted to parallel or join the single market, the EFTA countries, Norway, Iceland, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, none of them is remotely interested in joining the customs union. Why do you think that is?
They have separate arrangements. They have arrangements with each other, but they also have ways in which they resolved disputes. And it's like a mini European Union in the way that they work together. Now, I believe that we could consider being and approaching the EEA EFTA countries to see whether that would be an arrangement that could work for Britain, potentially alongside union, right? Some of the potentially alongside how we negotiate being in the customs union, fundamental for peace in Northern Ireland and the Good Friday Agreement. It's not just me saying that, it's the Irish government, it's the head of the Irish police, and it's the Irish people.
We'll need to leave it there because time is up. Thank you very much, Dan, for the questions. What you're advocating, Seema, is not Labour Party policy staying in the customs union. Do you believe you'll change Jeremy Corbyn's mind about this and get him to agree with you?
Well, I believe there is a debate. You know there's a debate going on in the Labour Party, and that is not to be, not unexpected, because as the situation changes, as new facts come to light, as we have to consider what life is going to be like with the end state post the transition, we will have that debate. Now, it's certainly the case that the range of views across the Labour Party are far less in terms of the spectrum than what's going on in the Conservative Party. And the fundamental issue is that we have a Prime Minister and a Cabinet that absolutely have no idea about an end state. They failed to reach any sort of agreement after 2 days of an away this week. And I think it is embarrassing for us as a nation that 19 months on after the referendum, we are in such disarray.
OK, well, Seema, Dan, thank you both very much for coming in and asking the questions.
There is a difference.
We can't finish the programme without, of course, returning to the topic that we're always talking about, and we started with the programme Brexit, because there is a lot coming up in the next couple of weeks. We're going to get a speech from Theresa May on security very shortly, and followed by that one on the end state. And we're going to hear from some other cabinet ministers as well. Explain to us the choreography of all of this, Tom.
Well, the government have become a massive pressure for not saying enough on the great Brexit vision, and the reason why, because they don't have one yet. They're still arguing amongst themselves, as we've discussed. So Boris Johnson made it known a month or so ago that he was going to make his own speech on the case for a liberal Brexit, whatever that ends up meaning. Now, we learn today, Number 10 have busily briefed the Sunday papers, that it won't just be Boris, it'll be a whole lot of other cabinet ministers making useful contribution in terms of speeches. David Davis, David Liddington, Liam Fox and Theresa May, finally at the end of this very long list.
But not Emma Rudd, not Philip Hammond, not any of the real kind of arch remainers in the cabinet.
In a way, they don't do Brexit central jobs. You know, they're not in charge of Brexit ministry, so you expect the Brexit ministers themselves to do that.
I don't agree with that at all.
Well,
Look,
that's why they're doing speeches. What's interesting is, were they always going to do this? Was this always part of Kevin's plan? Or is the entirety of government now the dog that's being wagged by the tail just to try and make Boris Johnson's
because he was going to make a speech anyway. They have to roll out speeches from everybody else.
They have to give him great cover by surrounding him by others also making their own speeches. It wouldn't surprise me in the slightest.
What a shocking waste of parliamentary time this is. But, you know, the truth...
Well, at least we're hearing from someone at some stage.
I know, but what the kind of pattern with this speech making is that somebody comes out and says something and then Number 10 immediately slaps them down, like post hoc. So you can't really listen to the thing you think you're listening to because you have no idea whether it will be contradicted the day after. And the idea
like Philip Hammond in Davos when he said we would only diverge very modestly from the EU, and then Number 10 were contradicting him immediately.
And the idea that you can have that Philip Hammond isn't a key Brexit minister. Come on, the impact of this is predominantly economic.
He is
and he's the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Of course, he's a Brexit minister. Of course, he's a.
There's coordination going on. Number 10. What they're most worried about, they're quite worried about the Remainers like Anna Soubry. What they're really worried about is Jacob Rees-Mogg and the ERG and the hard Brexit faction, who really could bring down the Prime Minister tomorrow if they wanted to. There's enough of them to submit letters of no confidence.
At some point, when the Prime Minister fleshes out in a little bit more detail her vision, she can't keep Anna Soubry and Jacob Rees-Mogg happy. Both of them have been very vocal this week. And the serious problem then in the Tory party?
Someone's going to have to compromise at some point. I think that the hardest Brexiteers have got to get real and realise that they have most of what they wanted. If you'd said almost 2 years ago that the UK would definitely be leaving all of the key institutions of the EU, definitely be leaving the single market, definitely be leaving the customs union, with a grey area around a customs agreement, that is something that I think a lot of pro-Brexit people, I voted for Brexit, would have accepted and pocketed as a good result. So how far do they want to...
But the Jacob Rees-Mogg faction of the party sound very unhappy with the direction of travel. They're complaining about all sorts of things, very vocally.
They do this, but what is difficult to work out is how much of that is people just positioning to try and shift the argument within Cabinet, just really trying to be, you know, outliers for an argument, so that there isn't too much of a compromise. It's really all a function of there not being leadership and there not being someone in charge of the process, and this is going to have to be, we have to confront this as a country at some point and just make a decision and get on with it one way or the other.
Well, when they do, you'll all be here to talk about it, I'm sure. Thanks very much to Tom Newton-Dunn, Zoe Williams and Ian Martin.
I've been